The Voss Assembly had reviewed 400 years of colonization data before selecting Kelvara 9 as humanity's designated settlement world, and every projection agreed on one point with total unanimity. Nothing could survive there longer than a decade without collapsing. They were wrong within the first winter. Kelvara 9 orbited its dim, distant star at the outermost habitable edge of any conceivable colonization threshold, a frozen rock where average surface temperatures hovered around -60 degrees Celsius, and the brief summer months, if they could even be called that, rarely climbed above freezing. The Voss Assembly had assigned it to humanity not out of cruelty exactly, but out of the same cold, bureaucratic calculation that governed every resource allocation decision across their 11-species alliance. Humanity was the newest member species, the least established, the one with the least political capital to contest an assignment that every other species in the assembly had specifically avoided requesting. It is, at minimum, technically habitable, Assembly Coordinator Threl Asvani had explained to the human delegation, with the particular diplomatic blandness of someone delivering unwelcome news through carefully neutral language. The atmosphere is breathable, if thin. The gravity falls within acceptable human tolerance ranges. We understand it presents considerable environmental challenges, but the Assembly's projection models indicate a viable, if modest, colonization outcome is achievable within 20 to 30 years, given sufficient patience and appropriate expectations. Ambassador Dorothy Ape, humanity's senior representative to the Voss Assembly, had accepted the assignment with a calm that the Assembly's own psychological analysts had privately flagged as either remarkable composure or dangerous naivety about the environmental realities involved. She requested, before formally accepting the colonization mandate, only one concession. "We'll take it," she said, "but we choose our own colonization methodology, no assembly oversight on settlement design. You've given us the planet nobody else wanted. The least you can do is let us figure out how to actually live there without a committee looking over our shoulder telling us we're doing it wrong." The Assembly, mildly surprised by the request but unable to identify any strategic reason to refuse it, granted the concession without particular concern. Every colonization model in their 400-year archive suggested humanity would need every available resource and considerably more than their allotted patience, simply to establish a marginal foothold on a world that harsher, more experienced species had specifically declined to attempt settling. The first human colonists arrived on Kelvara 9 8 months later, 412 settlers stepping off transport shuttles into a landscape of endless gray ice fields beneath a dim, distant sun, temperatures already well below anything most of them had personally experienced, wind carrying a bitter, penetrating cold that the Assembly's own environmental reports had described, with characteristic understatement, as operationally significant. Voss Assembly observer teams, assigned to monitor the colonization efforts' inevitable early struggles from a respectful orbital distance, expected to document a slow, grinding process of trial and error, resource depletion, and the gradual, painful establishment of minimal survival infrastructure, that their models predicted would take the better part of a decade before achieving anything resembling genuine stability. What they documented instead, over the following 3 years, would become one of the most extensively studied colonization efforts in the Assembly's entire archive, precisely because it violated nearly every predictive model their 400 years of accumulated data had ever produced. Humanity's approach to Kelvara 9, from the very first week, diverged sharply from the cautious, incremental settlement patterns every other assembly species favored when establishing colonies in hostile environments. Rather than concentrating initial resources on a single, heavily protected settlement designed to slowly expand outward as conditions permitted, the human colonists spread immediately across a wider footprint than assembly protocol considered advisable, establishing a network of smaller, interconnected outposts, specifically designed around the assumption that no single point of failure should be capable of threatening the entire colonization effort. This is tactically unsound. Assembly observer Kesik Thavral noted in his initial report, watching human engineering teams construct what appeared to be a deliberately redundant network of geothermal power stations across terrain his own species' colonization doctrine would have considered far too resource-intensive to prioritize during an initial settlement phase. They are investing disproportionate resources in infrastructure resilience during a period when survival itself should be the primary concern. This allocation strategy contradicts every established colonization framework in our archive. What Kesik Thavral's initial assessment failed to fully account for was the specific cultural inheritance human colonists brought to a frozen, hostile world that, while more extreme than anything in humanity's own historical experience, was not entirely without precedent in their species' long relationship with survival at the very edges of habitability. Humanity had, across their own homeworld's long and difficult history, settled and sustained permanent populations in environments that other assembly species would have classified as marginally habitable at best. Arctic regions where temperatures rivaled Kelvara 9 harshest conditions. High-altitude settlements where thin atmosphere created survival challenges most species never needed to solve. Desert environments where water scarcity demanded exactly the kind of redundant, distributed infrastructure thinking that Kesik Thavral's own doctrine considered inefficient. "We've done this before," explained Dr. Amara Osai, the colony's chief engineer, during a formal briefing with Assembly observers 6 months into the settlement effort, her tone carrying the particular patience of someone explaining a concept she suspected her audience would find difficult to fully credit. "Not this exact environment, obviously. Nobody's ever settled anywhere quite this cold before, not permanently. But the underlying problem, how do you sustain human life somewhere the environment is actively trying to kill you? That's not new to us. We've been solving variations of that problem for thousands of years, on our own world, long before we ever had the technology we're using now. Every solution we're building here is standing on top of lessons we learned the hard way generations ago. In places that weren't quite this extreme, but taught us the same fundamental principles." The Assembly's observer teams documented, with mounting scientific interest, a colonization pattern that consistently prioritized what their own doctrine would have considered premature investment in redundancy, community infrastructure, and long-term resilience over the more immediately efficient survival-focused approach every other assembly species favored during initial settlement phases. Human colonists built shared community spaces, heated common areas where colonists from different outposts could gather, share resources, and maintain social cohesion, during a period when assembly colonization doctrine specifically recommended minimizing non-essential construction in favor of pure survival infrastructure. They established, within the first year, an education system for the colony's children that assembly observers initially flagged as an unnecessary resource allocation, given the settlement's precarious early status, only to later note, with growing analytical interest, that the practice appeared to be deliberately reinforcing exactly the kind of multi-generational commitment to the settlement that assembly colonization models had never previously needed to account for. "They are not simply trying to survive here," Kesik Thavral wrote, in a report that marked a notable shift from his earlier skepticism, 18 months into the observation period. "They are behaving as though they have already decided, with a certainty our own colonization doctrine has never required of any assembly species, that this world will become permanently theirs, generations into the future, and every decision they make reflects that assumption regardless of the additional short-term risk it introduces. I do not yet understand whether this represents remarkable confidence or reckless disregard, for the very real survival challenges Kelvara 9 continues to present. The colony faced genuine crises during those first 18 months, precisely the kind of severe environmental challenges the Assembly's projection models had predicted. A geothermal power failure during the planet's harshest winter month left one of the smaller outposts without adequate heating for nearly 36 hours. A crisis that, under most Assembly colonization frameworks, would have represented a potentially catastrophic loss of life. Instead, the deliberately redundant infrastructure network humanity had insisted on building from the very first week allowed neighboring outposts to redirect emergency power and shelter capacity within hours. An evacuation and mutual support response that Assembly observers noted, with genuine surprise, appeared to have been specifically anticipated and planned for well before the actual crisis occurred. "We build for the bad days," Dr. Osa explained, when Assembly observers asked directly about the colony's apparent preparedness for a crisis their own models suggested should have been catastrophic. "Not the good days. Anybody can survive when everything's working fine. The whole point of building things the way we build them is making sure that when something inevitably breaks, and something always eventually breaks, no matter how good your engineering is, the people relying on it don't pay the price for our optimism. We learned that lesson a long time ago, usually the hard way, in a lot of different places on our own world that weren't nearly as forgiving as people from the outside sometimes assumed." By the end of the colony's second year, Kelvara 9's human settlement had grown to over 1,100 colonists, its network of interconnected outposts expanding steadily across terrain that Assembly projections had originally suggested would remain marginally habitable at best for at least a full decade. Agricultural domes, engineered specifically for the planet's thin atmosphere and minimal solar input, began producing sufficient food to reduce the colony's dependence on external supply shipments, a milestone Assembly colonization models had not projected occurring until well into the settlement's second decade of operation. The Assembly's formal reassessment of humanity's colonization capability, delivered at the end of the settlement's third year, arrived at conclusions that would fundamentally reshape the Alliance's broader strategic understanding of their newest member species. Kelvara 9 has achieved, within 3 years, a level of colonial stability and self-sufficiency that our own 400-year archive suggests should have required a minimum of 2 decades under optimal conditions, and considerably longer given the genuinely hostile environmental parameters involved. The Assembly's formal report concluded. This outcome cannot be adequately explained through superior technology alone, as human colonization equipment, while competent, does not represent a meaningful advancement over standard Assembly colonization infrastructure available to any member species. The explanation appears instead to lie in a fundamentally different cultural approach to hostile environment settlement, one that consistently prioritizes long-term communal resilience and redundant infrastructure over the short-term survival optimization that has governed every other Assembly species colonization doctrine for the entirety of our Alliance's recorded history. Humanity did not simply survive an environment our own models suggested was barely habitable. They appear to have approached that environment already believing, with a certainty no other Assembly species has ever brought to a colonization effort this challenging, that success was not merely possible but already effectively decided, requiring only the patient, systematic application of lessons their own species had already learned, across thousands of years and considerably different circumstances, about what it actually takes to make a hostile place feel like home. Ambassador Dorothy Ape, presenting humanity's own account of the Kelvara 9 colonization effort to the full Assembly Council 3 years after the initial settlement began, offered an explanation considerably simpler than the Assembly's own extensive analytical framework had produced. "You gave us the coldest, harshest planet in your entire catalog," she said, addressing a council chamber that had, over the preceding 3 years, developed a very different level of respect for humanity's capabilities than the mild diplomatic condescension that had characterized their first meeting. I think, honestly, some of you expected us to fail, or at least struggle badly enough that we'd stop pushing for equal standing within this assembly. I understand why you'd think that. By every metric your own colonization history would suggest, Kelvara 9 should have broken us, slowly, over years of grinding attrition against an environment that doesn't forgive mistakes. But here's what none of your models accounted for, she continued, her voice carrying the same calm, unshakable confidence she had brought to that very first negotiation 3 years earlier. Humanity has never had the luxury of only settling the easy places. Our own homeworld is full of environments that tried to kill anyone who attempted to live there, long before we ever had the technology we're using now. And we learned, generation after generation, that you don't survive those places by treating them as temporary hardships to be endured until something better comes along. You survive them by deciding from the very first day that this is home now, permanently, for you and for your children and for however many generations come after them. And then you build everything, every decision, every piece of infrastructure, every community structure, around the assumption that permanence requires. You gave us the coldest planet in the galaxy because you assumed it would humble us. Instead, it just reminded us of something we already knew from our own history, long before any of us ever left our own world. Cold doesn't kill people who have decided to belong somewhere. It only kills people who never fully committed to staying. The Assembly Council chamber remained silent for a long moment following her statement, the particular silence of an audience confronting a framework for understanding hostile environment colonization that their own 400-year archive had never previously needed to develop. Kelvara 9's human colony continued expanding steadily in the years that followed, eventually becoming, within a decade, one of the most stable and self-sufficient settlements in the entire VOS assembly, a fact that other member species, facing their own colonization challenges on marginal worlds throughout the Alliance's territory, increasingly found themselves studying with genuine scientific interest rather than the polite skepticism that had characterized the settlement's earliest years. Dr. Amara Osai, interviewed years later by a VOS researcher compiling a comprehensive study of humanity's colonization methodology for eventual application across other assembly worlds, offered a final observation that would become, within assembly colonization circles, one of the most frequently cited explanations for humanity's unexpected success on a world specifically chosen, because every other species had assumed it would prove too harsh for any meaningful settlement effort. You keep asking me what technology or technique explains what happened here, she said, standing in a colony common room that had, over a decade of continuous habitation, grown warm with the particular lived-in comfort of a genuine, permanent community rather than a temporary survival outpost. I keep trying to explain that the answer isn't really technical at all. It's just that we've never been a species that waits for a place to become easy before we decide to call it home. We decide first, and then we do whatever hard, patient work it takes to make that decision true. You gave us the coldest planet in the galaxy expecting it to defeat us within a decade. Instead, we just did what humans have always done, everywhere we've ever gone, since long before we ever had spaceships at all. We looked at an impossible place, and we decided together that impossible was just a temporary condition we hadn't gotten around to fixing yet.